Well, I'm delighted to be here and old stomping grounds. I first came here in August 1987. Before there was really an institute. Ginger was here. I don't know if she's in the room. Many other people. So I'm thrilled to be here. What I want to talk about is to build on the two talks we've already had this morning from Eric and Ricardo. I want to talk about the whole idea of the evolution of technology. And it's been a difficult subject and one that's has quite a long history. And most of what I have to say comes out of a book I wrote called The Nature of Technology. Some of you may have seen it. It came out 4 years ago, 2009. It still seems to be doing the rounds because Nature magazine a couple of weeks ago put it on their summer reading list. I should warn you, they also have Newton's Principia on that list too. My claim is my book's a little easier to read. Anyway, 4 years after Darwin brought out The Origin of Species, so that would be in 1863, a boat pulled into New Zealand, a ship, bearing a copy, and Samuel Butler, who was kind of banished to New Zealand at that time, trying to escape his father, got hold of Darwin's book. He was kind of carried away by it. And he started to wonder, he wrote an essay at that time that many of you may have read, Darwin Among the Machines, wondering if there could be a theory of evolution for machines, or the kingdom of machines, as he called them, what we've now called technology. And he proposed that there should be such a thing, a theory of evolution for technology. And the whole idea, nobody ever came up with a cohesive theory, but the idea was bumped around in the literature, proposed, always proposals, we should have such a theory, and some attempts were made on it in the 1930s and further along. The last attempt that I know of was by George Bassala, who's a historian of technology, 1988. And then I brought out my own book 4 years ago. And what I want to talk to you today about is the conclusions I came to. I think that a theory of evolution, a full-blown theory of evolution for technology is indeed possible. And my claim is I have one in my book, and you're very welcome to look at it. Anyway, this is what I want to talk about. And it's not Darwinian, as this title shows. Now, a lot of what Eric has said this morning I will build on, but keep in mind that the story I give will take its hat off to Darwin, where Darwin does apply, but will also point to a somewhat different mechanism, or a quite different mechanism from Darwin's. And that's the basic idea here. So the question is, can there be such a thing as a theory of evolution for technology? I want to draw attention to two very different meanings of technology. One is that lineages alter their form, so you can have things like the, French ballet, how has that evolved over the centuries, or the Russian ballet, or English madrigals. And that does indeed apply to technology. Obviously, things like aircraft do modify their form over time, from the Wright brothers to a modern F-35C jet fighter or something like that. So there is descent by modification, but this is the question that this is the type of evolution I want to talk about. And that all organisms are related by ties of genealogy or descent from common ancestry. Is there such a thing as an ancestral family tree of technology? And I'm going to claim that there is, under very specific circumstances. those two definitions I got out of an essay by Stephen Jay Gould. And so I want to be very clear about this distinction. I'm not just saying a technology like the helicopter somehow alters its form over its life. That's pretty obvious. Is there such a thing as descent from common ancestry in technology? And I believe indeed there is. Now, in that second question, people have made great attempts to apply Darwin's mechanism. Everybody knows Darwin was on about variation and selection. He didn't know what caused variation. We know a huge amount about that with molecular biology and genetics and genomics these days. So that's very well understood. But notice here he's talking about the steady accumulation through natural selection of small differences. And then these give rise to all the important modifications of structure. Another quote from Darwin, complex organs formed by numerous successive slight modifications. Now, it's absolutely obvious that that applies to technology, that there are numerous slight modifications in the jet engine. Take any technology in dyeing techniques. But there is a bit, and pretty well everybody who looked at this was basically saying, if you want a theory of evolution for technology, it should be Darwinian, because after all, that's evolution, isn't it? Actually, and again, as probably all of you know in this room, Darwin was very little concerned with evolution. In fact, he doesn't mention the word that much in his book. Darwin was concerned with the mechanisms by which speciation took place. Because many, many people in his day accepted evolution, at least in his circle, that wasn't so much under query. What was under query is, how does the heredity work? How does speciation occur? So again, in our parlance, what we're interested in, if I can figure the clicker, whoop, obviously I didn't here. Just a sec. Oh yeah, so that doesn't quite work for technology. Let me try this again. Okay. The reason why Darwin's explanation fails for technology is that quite often radical technologies come along. Think of the jet engine. Think of the polymerase chain reaction. Think of any radically different technology, and it doesn't come out of small variations in what went before. The jet engine is absolutely different from air piston engines. And to modify what Eric quoted from Schumpeter this morning, think of radar. You can arrange radio circuits in any way you want. You will never get radar thereby. You can rearrange piston engines any way you want. You will never get radar thereby. The reason is that radar and jet engines and polymerase chain reaction, they work on radically different principles from what went before. They are different. And so the question is, how do they arise? So let me be very careful what I'm saying here. I'm talking about radically novel technologies when I'm talking about descent, but those are the ones that really count. Again, telegraphy didn't give us radio. Radio itself was a radically different technology, etc. How do these things come into being? That's our question. And so what we're looking for is a mechanism, and basically a mechanism of heredity. And it can't be quite Darwin's because it's not successive small changes. It has to be some heredity that's more abrupt. And we're going to look for it in the speciation of technology, which is what we usually call invention. So let me talk about invention then for a while. I want to say there's an awful lot to be said about invention. I have a paper on it, and I'll see if I can leave some copies outside from 2006. And I've thought a great deal about it, and many others in this room have. Invention was a very strange thing, by the way, in economics or in engineering. It's like consciousness in cognition or psychology. Everybody's willing to talk about it. Nobody's willing to say where it comes from. Say, well, yes, we acknowledge there's something called consciousness. Well, how did it get there? What is it? What does it consist of? Well, things sort of blank out at that stage. Invention in technology, at least up until recently, has had the same status. People say, oh yeah, there's invention, and that happens. How does it happen? Well, an act of creation. Oh, how does the act of creation happen? Well, and then the argument fades off. So I want to go into invention in some detail. I also want to talk about, I'm sure this will come up in the questions, that when you're dealing with invention, society matters, people matter, intelligence matters. It's a bit like if you're fighting the Battle of Waterloo, you could say, well, who was shooting whom, who was with cannonades at the battlefront. But what won the Battle of Waterloo were the supply lines, the Prussians coming in at the last, the way the regiments had been trained, the way Napoleon operated, etc., etc. So there's a pyramid of causality. I'm talking about the very sharp end here, the actual process of invention that does go on in people's brains. So bear in mind that there's a much larger societal context, a lab context often these days, a scientific context. All of this counts, but I'm talking about the sharp end here. Basically, and this condenses a huge amount of study and a huge amount of thinking and a huge amount of ink, certainly in my own work, I want to reduce invention really to one idea. It's the linking of a need with the idea of some effect that will fulfill it. All technologies are dependent on effects or phenomena. Radar uses a certain phenomenon, it's a physical one. Radio uses a phenomenon. Polymerase chain reaction uses certain genetic phenomena, etc., etc. So basically, people are confronted with a need, and they say, well, yes, I think I can sort of meet that need or somehow solve that need by a certain effect. Now, I call the idea of an effect is a principle. So they wheel up some principle that will deal with that need. There may be very different principles that could meet the same need, and sometimes effects are discovered. Think of a phenomenon like X-radiation or nuclear magnetic resonance, and those are discovered, and the causality goes in the other way. The effect is discovered, and it's pretty obvious that you could use that for some human purpose or need. In fact, when Röntgen discovered X-rays in 1895, it was only a matter of weeks before he started to put different materials in the beam to see what would happen photographically. And one of the things he put in the way was his own hand and then his wife's hand. And there's absolutely beautiful photographs in December 1895, 2 months after the discovery, of her skeletal hand with wedding rings on it. And very, very beautiful. After that, the whole idea of imaging bones was what you would call something of a no-brainer. I told an audience that one time, and I conjectured his wife may have died of cancer. And before the end of the lecture, somebody had done the appropriate search. Unfortunately, she did. So it's the linking of a need with the idea of some effect that will fulfill it. But this isn't sort of genius sitting down and saying, oh, and then the penny drops. It's much more than that. if you have the idea of some effect that might fulfill something, to get that effect to work normally poses sub-problems. By the way, I work at Xerox PARC, and I think there's enough techies in the room that will attest to this, and scientists too, because if you're trying to get some effect in science, say, well, I think I could get this maser set up like Charles Townsend did to resonate, but I could get that if I could get this to happen. But to get that to happen, I'd need to solve this other problem. So there's a hierarchy of sub-problems. It's a bit like doing Sudoku. I think I can get that into place here, but if that were in place there, this would have to be in place here. And so you're going up and down this cognitive hierarchy of problems that where you're trying to solve. And you can solve one at one lower level, and then that will solve an obstacle you had at a higher level. That might ricochet back up the hierarchy and you have the whole thing solved. But usually there's many, many sub-problems and many sub-solutions. The process takes time. Very often it takes a team of people. And that process is, man, if I can get this to work, that process is recursive. So again, it's like solving a puzzle. This part will work if I can get that part to work. Or if you like, it's like planning a route up a mountain that hasn't been climbed before. I think we could do this over the South Col, but if we did that, there'd be ice falls in the way, and there'd be a ridge here where we'd have to watch out for rock falls, and that's dangerous. How could we get past that? Well, the ice falls, if we did that, we could solve this way. So again, you're going up and down a hierarchy. When all is resolved, and this is a huge amount about invention being subsumed into maybe 2 minutes here, which isn't quite fair, then when these problems are resolved, all those sub-problems have been resolved, the overall problem is resolved, and then you have something to work with. Notice that the result is a combination of things. Now, this is a word that's very familiar to people who work with technology. The idea of combination in technology is said to have originated with Schumpeter. It didn't quite. A guy called Robert Thurston, I discovered in Stanford's Stacks, has a book talking about it in 1888. And no doubt it was there in the annals of Genghis Khan or, whoever back, Lucretius probably wrote about it in Roman times. It's really good ideas are never quite original. Somebody's thought of some version of that. But the result is a combination. So basically, what we're talking about is a combination. But people who do this sort of thing aren't thinking I'm making a combination. Any more than I am, I'm giving you combinations of English words, at least my version of English words, and I'm not very aware I'm creating combinations. I'm putting together building blocks that will do the job, and there's many, many ways I can do this. Let me give you an example of this at my lab, or where I work, Xerox PARC. I work in the Intelligence Systems Lab, so it's basically, in Ricardo's terms, geeks and techies, people who need to be fed every so often. And yeah. So in 1972, one of the big problems with computers was how to print images, or how to print different fonts, or how to do something. The printing part of computation, if you remember, some of you might, was by line printers, essentially big mechanical typewriters controlled by a computer. Could general images be printed? And there are various principles. Now, this was the idea of some effect that that could be used to meet that need. Starkweather and his companions. I wonder if anything can be done about this booming. No? Starkweather and his companions were pretty well aware. There are many ways we could do this. Well, we could have a cathode ray tube, and we could use a computer to project the image on a cathode ray tube. That's easy. We know how to do that. That's basically television. We can photograph the image and transfer that to paper or some such thing. Or we could use heat-sensitive paper. The promising idea that fascinated Starkweather was a radical idea. It was to use a laser to paint images on a Xerox drum. Now recall that xerography itself is nothing else but having a drum that statically attracts ink with static electricity, and it's light sensitive, and that makes it ready, so to speak, electrostatically to attract ink, and you just have to shine a light beam on a Xerox drum. Starkweather's idea was to do this with a laser, and I went through a lot of the original documents. It's absolutely fascinating to see how this happened. Somebody said, well, it just burned through, with the laser, you immediately burn through the Xerox drum. It would work the first time, the second time after that, it would be just steaming mess of rubber goo or whatever it is. And so various sub-problems immediately showed up. Here is one of them. Modulating the laser. That sounds a bit technical, but basically if you want to get high-resolution dots on a Xerox drum, maybe 100 per inch or something, you're going to have to switch your laser off and on to get the black and white pixels. And rough calculations showed Starkweather that he'd have to do this at the rate of 50 megahertz. That's 50 million times a second. Nobody had been able to modulate a laser at that rate. That took a year or two to figure out. He used a piezoelectric circuit with a polarizing filter. And this was new. Then he came up with another problem, and that was, well, how do I move the laser rapidly? You'd sort of think, well, I could scan the whole laser across, but don't forget the laser beam is extraordinarily thin. So he and the lasers of those days were huge affairs, costing $50,000 a go. And, this huge thing, and you'd have to move it, he calculated, across the Xerox drum thousands of times a second to get the resolution you wanted. And this, again, was a problem solved, in his case, by mirrors, not smoke, but a mirror. The idea was that he wouldn't move the laser installation, which was heavy, but he could move the light beam. Much as a lighthouse uses a mirror to scan light right across the horizon, he could use a mirror to scan right across the Xerox drum. Mirror would have multiple facets and keep scanning lines. But that led to another problem. The problem was lining up the mirror facets. And if you look at the lab notebooks, he figures out again that he'd have to have the facets of this hexagonal mirror aligned to less than 6 arc seconds. And you couldn't machine things that accurately, at least at a low enough price. So what did he do for that? Well, he had a master's degree in optics, PhD in lasers, and he solved the problem optically. Here is the final large version of the solution. There's the laser. It's not moving. There's the moving mirror. And there's the optics, all very schematic. There's your Xerox drum. There's the picture getting painted on the Xerox drum, and so on. Notice it is a combination of a laser, mirrors, optics, Xerox drum, everything that existed already. So if I came to a conclusion, and this sounds very philosophical, that invention consists of finding something within what exists already. Finding a solution from what you have already. Let me speed up at this stage, but notice again its combination, that a laser printer is possible and happens once you have a laser, a computer, xerography, mirrors, etc., and it has its ancestry in those things. If you like more visual things, early train, I reckon this one's about 1832 from various hints. here, but notice the carriages. It has a train of carriages, much as ladies had a bustle and then a train behind them. And that's where the word train came from. And in English, we talk about, we don't get on a railway car. To this day, you get on a carriage. But notice again, this is a combination. Here's a more serious one. This is early radar. Again, all these parts and pieces consist of parts and pieces that were already known, that were already available. It's all combinations, right down to the lowest vacuum tube. This bit here, duplexer, I don't have time to go into it, but that needed, that's basically to separate the sending out of the beam from the receiving, so that the sending out of a radar beam doesn't squash the acoustics of listening to one, the echo coming back. That part had to be invented. It had to be found in what exists before. So we're arriving at what I call combinatorial evolution. I thought of many names for this sort of evolution, but the basic idea here is that technology combines previously existing technologies that make that technology possible, make it work, make it manufacturable. It's not that neat. You don't get two parents in this case. You maybe get a multiplicity of parents. But it's basically, technologies are very much like forming a vast chemistry of elements, more and more elaborate molecules from previous molecules that have been created from previous molecules, back to basic elements. The basic elements in technology are the capture of natural phenomena. By the way, I thought a lot about this word combinatorial. The proper word in English is combinatory. And I tried that word. I'd never heard it. It's in the dictionary. Anything to do with combination is combinatory. I tried to sell that in an article or two, and people said, "Oh, I like your thing in combinatorial." So I gave up. This is combinatorial evolution, whether I like it or not. So the collective of technology is indeed a vast ancestral network, and if you like, creating new nodes from existing parental nodes, maybe many of them. It is, as Eric said this morning, it's autopoietic, not autopoetic. I'm Irish, so I'd love it to be autopoetic, but it's not. It's autopoiesis means self-producing, and so it's self-producing. That vast network of things create new things. So technology builds itself out of itself. And as Eric was showing with all the SKUs, complication builds from simplicity very naturally in all of this. And there may be obstructions to where this happens and so on, as Ricardo's talk was showing. So all of this suggests an evolutionary algorithm. I want to go through this pretty quickly. So if I want to reduce this to a general algorithm, here's the algorithm. You start with a soup. I don't know what else to call it, a soup of elements. You form combinations, maybe at random, maybe not, maybe by design. Most of those combinations aren't that useful, but if one is useful, and that would have to be in some world that it's in, then encapsulate that combination. Give it a name, box it in, preserve it. Let's call it the polymerase chain reaction. Now we have a machine that will do it. It's useful as an element, and we can add that to the soup of functionalities that are available in doing genomic technology. Contrast that with Darwin's algorithm. I'm not saying this is inferior, it's just different. He starts with the population, not with the soup. He needs variations, then you select differentially, and then you throw that into the population, or the new population reproduces further variations, and the population, the individuals, start to diverge in this way, slowly and incrementally. Whereas here you don't get a divergence, you just get a soup that's growing and growing and growing. I want to one question that very naturally came up early on, this was about 2006 when I was thinking about this stuff. I was working for Fuji Xerox Palo Alto Lab, FX PAL. It's just down the street from Park where I was working. And the guy who runs that asked me, can you do anything for us in complexity? So this was great, it's like asking a burglar, would you kindly break into my house here? So I did work with a superb guy, a computer scientist, Wolfgang Pollack. What I wanted to see is, could I have a demo of this combinatorial evolution in practice? So I want to walk you through this, but very quickly. Here was our idea. We were going to, and we did in Wolfgang's and Pollack's computer, our idea was to create an artificial world. We see the word artificial in Santa Fe, that always means it's on a computer, in which technologies evolve indefinitely from previous ones. So we would allow our system to continually create technologies by combining previous technologies, throwing most of them out, preserving good ones. And we needed a test bed for this, so the technologies we chose were logic circuits. Logic circuits these were digital logic circuits. Logic circuits are great because the output of a logic circuit can be connected to the input of a logic circuit, and the combination gives you a new logic circuit. So we're still in the same bailiwick. Here was our algorithm. We start from one primitive element. It turned out to be a not-AND gate. Forget the technicalities if you're not a design engineer. But it's a NAND gate. That's really one of the elements of integrated circuits and modern electronics. And we had a wish list of target logic purposes. None of these had been realized. We just said, wouldn't it be lovely to have a 3-bit exclusive OR logic circuit if we could do this? Wouldn't it be great to have a 5-bit adder? Wouldn't it be great to have this? Now, people say, but you gave the needs out. You just had a big list. Well, that's cheating, etc. Well, if we had done this absolutely fully and had 2 more years, we would have had an artificial world. We would have little agents within Pollack's computer and green eye shades. They would have been doing arithmetic, and they would love to have some of these logic things. But we just cut through all of that and said on the demand side, we're declaring that we have 80 or 100 things we'd love to do if they were ever produced by this algorithm. So we're starting with a whole bunch of not-AND gates. They're extraordinarily primitive. Think of them as Lego blocks. And we start to wire them together randomly, and we want to see if anything interesting comes out. Most things aren't that interesting. We can test what they do afterwards. And if something interesting comes out that matches on our wish list, we say, we're going to take this more complicated Lego block than before. We're going to fuse all the little pieces together, and that'll be a new Lego block all set for further combination. So I hope you get the algorithm. We're just basically, you could call this the Lego block algorithm. Interesting was the standard sorts of logic operations that are done. This is a really good question, and hold that to the end because there's a big story behind this. So then if we had novel circuits that were encapsulated, we just threw that into the soup. Now notice there's no finish to this. You're never finished. We weren't trying to solve a problem. We had a lot of discussions with people there, patent lawyers and all kinds of things. What were we solving? We weren't solving anything. We were building a toolbox of logic operations. I'm trained as an electronic engineer, an electrical engineer. I'm trained at British University, which means that they take engineering very seriously. They do here too. But I couldn't sit down and design you an 8-bit adder without spending 2 or 3 weeks figuring out how to do it. However, I could sit down, having been at Santa Fe, and design an algorithm that might produce such. What did we get? Well, the thing ran. We ran it and reran it and reran it. It took 20 hours at a go on Pollack's computer. And we got quite complicated circuits evolving. It was a bit like Tom Ray's world, if any of you remember that Tierra. We got a whole zoo of circuits coming out, different ones in different runs. We, in the end, after in 20 hours, Pollack just shuts the thing off. We kind of take the net out of the water, see what creatures we have. Was there anything interesting? Well, typically we would get 8-way exclusive ORs, 8-bit AND circuits, and so on. Many of the runs we got 8-bit adders. Now, I want to say something about that. We weren't looking for 8-bit adders or 8-bit comparators or comparators. We got interesting animals here. And I thought, well, we got an 8-bit adder, so what, you know. Then I thought, well, hang on a moment. An 8-bit adder was the heart of a Hewlett-Packard calculator in 1974. I remember buying one with a huge amount of my grad school postdoc money or whatever it was. And that was a huge step to get an 8-bit adder working as an integrated circuit. But our algorithm, combinatorial evolution, had designed one automatically. And then I was on a flight to Iceland one time, and I thought, well, you know, 8-bit adders, give me a break. That's not that hard to design or come up with. Maybe at random we could have come up with that. So I figured out how many 8-bit adders there are. 8 bits means that there's 8 bits of X, 8 bits of Y, and then you add those to get Z. Z has 9 bits because of 8 bits plus a carry. So there's 16 inputs and 9 outputs. How many logic circuits could you get in binary digits with such inputs and outputs? Joe here could probably do this in half a second, but it took me half an hour. So, but the answer is 10 to the power of 177,000. So if I wrote the digits in a book by, print them out with Mathematica, if I wrote the number of circuits in a book, it would take about half of a standard book to show you how many circuits there are. Or, if you like, that's the number of elementary particles in the universe, cubed and cubed and cubed, and etc. It's a big number. Yet our algorithm was able to find such circuits correctly within 20 hours. The experiment showed path dependence. Technologies or circuits that came out early on, simple ones, became the basic building blocks of further ones. It showed a Cambrian explosion in most of our runs. Nothing, very simple stuff, just really incredibly simple stuff. And then suddenly it would take off. It showed that intermediate circuits were necessary, or you couldn't get complicated ones. If we left out intermediate needs, we wouldn't get anything complicated because there wouldn't be the intermediate building blocks to build from. This is a major finding, by the way, in biology. There's a gorgeous paper by Rich Lenski and other people in Nature around about 2005 that used other means to show this. But basically, how does an eye come out? Well, you need a lot of intermediate circuitry. It's useful to be able to tell night from day, blurred vision from no vision, etc. So with those intermediate things, you can indeed get there. I want to finish maybe a little early, thanks, Jose. So I was kind of, just to finish here on this experiment, I was kind of blown away by the whole thing. There's, I don't know if I should admit this or not, but there's an incredible feeling of power when you have a computer algorithm that produces stuff. And I don't know, many of you here would have experienced this. Maybe it's the same if you write a book or poetry. But I was thinking that I wasn't a miserable engineer. I had done extraordinarily well in my engineering classes, but we were sort of shaking the net and getting these very fancy circuits out of there. My God, an algorithm produced this. And I don't think we could have got it by variation and selection. Just look at the combinatorial numbers involved. Or we could have maybe if we'd spent 500 million years and et cetera, et cetera. So let me just point to some more general things here. I want to fast forward here to something much more general. This is if no matter what idea that we come up with at Santa Fe in science, there's always an intimation or some hint that somebody's thought of it already. I got very many hints once I had kind of seen how this worked. But here's a rather beautiful one from François Jacob, and I think this is around about 1981. It's in his autobiography. I'm going to read this. In our universe, matter is arranged in a hierarchy of structures by successive integrations, putting the Lego blocks together. Whether inanimate or living, the objects found on Earth are always organizations or systems. Each system at a given level uses as its ingredients some systems from a simpler level. That is the way our universe is organized, or our world is organized. There are exceptions, but this is the main way things are organized. The great diversity of vertebrates results from differences in the arrangement and the number and distribution of these few building blocks. By the way, Jacob, who died last year, he was saying this quite a bit before we had very detailed knowledge of Hox genes, of how Evo-Devo works, how those building blocks are put together by genetic regulatory networks. So I think this is very prescient. Let me go back to saying that, so this sort of evolution, if we think in terms of that the algorithm I showed you, or what François Jacob said, it occurs in many chemistries, or all chemistries, I guess. They're put together from elementary building blocks that evolve more sophisticated things by combination, which come available for yet more sophisticated things. We're in Harold Morowitz territory here, if you know him from Santa Fe. It occurs in genetic regulatory networks. And I've been having a lot of conversations with Doug Irwin, who'll be here next week, about this. Doug is an expert, a paleobiologist, used to be head of faculty here at SFI, and is an expert in genetic regulatory networks. GRNs, as they're called, are basically circuits for switching on and off gene expression. So it's basically kind of logic circuits for genes. And they're the basic building blocks of organisms that develop embryonically and regulate themselves as full adult organisms. It occurs in the physical cosmos, and again, I think that some people have talked, in fact, you see this quite often. You know, in the beginning, there were quarks, or then elementary particles as combinations, then more complicated things, atoms and molecules, star systems, stars explode, planetary systems, ... So I don't think that I know enough to be completely comfortable here. I'm much more comfortable at this level. Also occurs in mathematics. And I want to point out that mathematics, there's much more going on than just pure combination, obviously. But it is a system that builds out of elementary building blocks. Think of those as theorems and lemmas. Using those glued together with logic to produce other structures, among which are more theorems and lemmas. Mathematics is really about structure and about the existence of various structures tied together logically. but it's basically building itself up from elementary functionalities, or whatever you want to call them, theorems and lemmas and propositions, into much more complication. There's a huge story to be told there. Again, I don't feel that I know enough to give the full story. The collective of technology itself, as I've just argued. To summarize, I think there is a difference, there's a strong difference between biological and technological evolution. Biological evolution is Darwinian variation and selection as its basis. We would now say in neo-Darwinism, a century of Darwinism, we'd say, well, the variation, that's basically molecular genetics. We understand a great deal of that. The selection is messy. The selection's getting out there in the real world, and it can be done by mortality, which is what Darwin was heavily influenced by, Malthus, and by fertility, differential fertility. It's all about the accumulation of incremental changes. And I've had numerous conversations with Peter Schuster and many others, including Doug Irwin, say, don't forget combination in biology. Multicellular animals, genetic regulatory networks. There's an awful lot of combination as well in biology. But still, if you look at the textbooks, it's the basic Darwinian things at the center, and then there is quite a lot of combination, but on a somewhat rarer basis. With technology, it's basically combinatorial. The transitions are abrupt. The basic operation is encapsulation of something that's new and useful. The whole thing is not so much accumulation of incremental changes. It's all about self-augmentation. Oh, we now can do that functionality in genetics. Oh, now we can do that. Well, we can combine those functionalities. Genomics and genetics, proteomics, those all grow. There is a great deal of Darwinian evolution once the technology exists, and this is something I'm sure Doan knows loads and loads about. The Wright brothers, as I said earlier, there's a line of descent, and technologies improve enormously. A great deal of that is just pure Darwinian variation and selection. So to finish this up, yes, I believe, and I'm sticking my neck out here, I do believe that there is a second mechanism of evolution, meaning a different one from the one that Darwin proposed. It's combinatorial or combinatory evolution. And this occurs, as Jacob pointed out, successive integrations in many, many systems. And that doesn't negate Darwin in any way. Darwin's mechanism occurs in many other things. And indeed, in many systems, the two are intermixed, but they're very distinct. And to answer the question I posed at the beginning, yes, the collective of technology evolves from common ancestry at the beginning, primarily through this mechanism of combinatorial evolution, with a lot of Darwin stuff on the side once a technology like the jet engine does exist. And so I'll finish there. Thank you very much indeed.
So you did a little bit of a bait and switch on us. And that was, you presented a theory of how technology could advance using this algorithm.
Yeah.
But it's certainly not the way that technology did advance using humans. You explained that process, which was one of decomposition.
Yeah.
Okay, and I thought that was a very nice explanation. And then you produced an algorithm which didn't do decomposition at all, but built up from existing technologies.
Yeah.
And then found out whether it had produced anything interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so you could have built an algorithm that worked by decomposition, and some people
I don't know what do you mean decomposition?
Starting from the need,
Yeah.
saying which technologies.
All right. Sure.
Right. That's actually harder. But
Yeah.
the magic in
Yeah.
the compositional approach
Yeah.
is in deciding what's interesting and what combinations you're going to use to build the intermediate pieces.
Right.
And Herb Simon back in the 60s talked about the need in the science of the artificial,
Yeah.
about the need of those intermediate pieces, which he called modularity.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. The book I wrote called The Nature of Technology is mostly about, practically all of it is about how actual technology has grown from the forest floor, so to speak, like the image that Eric showed this morning, going from very primitive early technologies to 2001 technologies we have. And there is a continuum, there is an ancestry. That ancestry is not a tree because it's highly networked. So I will claim that's in my book. That's what I was talking about earlier on. You're quite right. Logically, there's a difference between what I was trying to show. In the little FXPAL example, in that lab example on the computer, I did not mean to say that that was exactly how human technology had evolved. In fact, I was careful not to say that. Because with human technologies, there's human beings, there's designers, things start with a need, it's decomposed, as you say. It's an elaborate story. What I wanted to check in the lab is if you kept combining things and testing them against usefulness, how fast would that build anything, or would it build anything at all? We found the answer to that was a big yes, and that surprised me. Your comment, I think, is really subtle. And so let me draw out a couple more things on this. To make that into a more realistic experiment, what we should have done is had an artificial world where needs would arise naturally in that world, and where we had artificially intelligent designers, little know-me things in the computer, combining and trying to meet needs. We didn't do that for very obvious reasons. I just wanted to see if this damn thing worked or not. Sure, the algorithm worked. Some PhD student, I hope, there's been a few dissertations now based on this. Somebody's going to do that. We would needed artificially intelligent designers. So you're right, there is a difference between the what happened in the real world and our very basic experiment. It's basically like saying, we're looking at something in a Petri dish evolving here. That doesn't mean that that's a perfect mirror for how evolution is. You don't get dinosaurs in a Petri dish, etc. The other thing, and this is the subtle part of it, is that if we had given weird needs as truth tables or weird circuits that were needed, that were sort of random and not very structured, we wouldn't have got anything if we were looking for weird technologies that were more complicated. Because weirdness, there's many ways that weirdness builds upon weirdness. There are a few ways that order builds upon order. So we were relying on the idea that you can build complicated order out of simple order. And when we started to do those weird experiments, we indeed found that nothing very interesting happened, which I thought was a very positive thing to learn as well.
Since John Holland isn't here, I wanted to channel him and push back a little bit on your distinction that you're making between biological evolution in terms of combinatorialness. I think John would argue, the inspiration for genetic algorithms was the combinatorial nature of sexual reproduction.
Yep.
And, my understanding is that among mammals and organisms that among organisms that practice sexual reproduction, which is most of the ones we're familiar with, that's the main event. Mutation is a fairly minor event generating variation. So it's not obvious to me that there's any real, I would say they're both combinatorial evolution. I think the harder question is about whether there's some magic occurs when a jet engine happens that's different than the magic that occurs when, say, an eye first happens.
Yeah.
And I'm not convinced of that either, because obviously it's pretty magical when you first begin to have photon receptors that allow you to do a fundamentally different thing than you were doing before you had a photon receptor. So I'm just pushing back a little bit on that in the spirit of the debate we're having.
Well, I know John's work pretty well, and a lot of my inspiration actually came out of working with him for so long here at SFI. But I want to say this, I don't agree that this is just another variation of... there are major differences. One is that normally, John is right that recombination is very powerful, and many people claim it's more powerful than mutation. John is one of them. I've seen him argue this. So recombination is important. But we're not doing recombination. Technology is not recombination. In fact, if people use that term, that's basically wrong. You're building completely new things. So I would believe that John is taking the same library, one genome, and he has a population, just like Darwin had, and the population keeps changing. What is happening is getting variation out of different combinations and testing those. So it's variation selection in a large population. I like his algorithm. I think it's really good. Our algorithm is fundamentally different. We don't deal with the population. We deal with elements, more like a chemistry. Keep putting those together to see if we get new elements. Keep putting those together to see if anything interesting happens. And it builds up. So this is about combination, not recombination. If we had the same genome just being reshuffled all the time, then I would say, yeah, we heavily overlap with John. I claim it's different. Fuji Xerox that I worked for patented the algorithm. You could argue that's good or bad. I think it was a defensive thing to do. So we had that argument with the patent attorneys, and we won. Moreover, there's been a thesis at MIT that has compared genetic programming and the GED genetic algorithm with our algorithm. And there are major differences that show up in performance, in the way the algorithm's written, and so on. What we are doing, though, is very close to horizontal gene transfer, which takes place in the archaea. This is bacteria that continually swap genes, and the genome length I imagine, can vary. So I believe there are fundamental differences. I do believe combination is very important in biology, but I don't think this is the same thing. Well, yes, there is not so much selection, but if something is useful, then it is encapsulated. But this is the way actual technology works. Actual technology, be it in real technology done or in our lab experiment, is certainly not done by recombination. Engineers don't throw things up in the air. I hope I'm not caricaturing what you say. It's actually very thoughtful, and it's drawing upon what exists to make a large expression that will do the job. Very similar to what lawyers do. Lawyers put together pieces from past verdicts, from statutes, these are all cobbled together to make into an argument. And anyway, it's certainly not random recombination.
So my question is pretty much about what you just said, about how innovation is thoughtful versus combinatorial evolution of innovation. So probably innovation comes from combining technologies, but that's not the same as having combinatorics of evolution.
As having what?
As having combinatorics of technologies to predict how technologies will evolve. If you have combinatorics, you're generally going to get a factorial growth with a number of elements. So what you're showing in your lab experiment in the real world will probably blow up. It's the real world equivalent is like the question of if you have monkeys in a room with a type Shakespeare or anything interesting, which they will if you have a gazillion monkeys for a gazillion years in that room. If you have technologies and you just do combinatorics of the technologies, chances are you're not going to produce anything interesting if you're restricted to the numbers of humans and the number of years that we've been around.
Well, let me maybe I'm getting tired here, but I did not say humans. I've expressly said at least twice that humans do not do combinatorics with technology. I work in a lab at Park. They don't randomly combine anything. That's not the way it's ever happened in actual life. But when a new technology emerges, it is put together from what exists already. So this is not humans doing combinatorics. Things don't blow up. It expressly is not that. The lab experiment I showed you was not an expression of the real world. As I say, it's a bit like asking variation of selection, Darwin style, to happen on a Petri dish. Nobody said that's the way the whole world has worked. You're just looking at the mechanism. If you look at the mechanism and allow it to do that, the interesting thing was that we sort of had a proof of concept that interesting things can emerge in the lab. So I'll leave it there. I think that the way technology has evolved is human. It's wonderful. It's been by design. It's socially directed. And it is a case of thinking backwards from need to putting together a solution. The way you do if you're a detective trying to solve a murder, we know that the following facts are there. We know the following people might have been involved. Can I put together a story? That story that emerges and that gets fought out in court is a combination. This person with those instruments, with these other people, these facts, it's a combination of ideas or functionalities. It doesn't mean that anybody's throwing anything up and just making random combinations.
Okay, now on. I'm going to ask two maybe slightly naive questions coming from my own background as a designer. I think it's been touched on in the last few questions that real design and innovation of the world happens in a much more directed way than the kind of experiments you're talking about. But
look, let me say, I gave one experiment.
Yes.
That is not what I was talking about. I talked at some length about invention, Gary Starkweather.
Yes.
So let me say this the 10th time. The experiment is a proof of concept for an algorithm. Actual design happens in the way you're about to tell us, so go ahead.
No. I'm actually, I get the distinction, and I very much appreciate it. And in fact, what the two questions that I'm trying to ask are in my interest in your own, what your take is on the distinction between the two modes of innovation that you presented. The first one with the laser printer, and the second one with the experiment. And the two questions are: in the second regard, I can imagine, of course, there's a real qualitative difference between the evolved addition circuit and a designed addition circuit, and I'm sure many people would tell us that the designed one is better in almost every way. But my question to you is: is there a way, or was there a way, looking at it, that the evolved circuit was in any way superior to the designed one, maybe in terms of its kind of robustness, or who knows? So I don't know. That's my first question. And the second question is a kind of the inverse of it, which is to say that we can regard the sort of combinatorial the algorithmic simulated evolution as in some way the kind of reflex reaction would be to regard it as some way inferior or inaccurate because it doesn't have the designers in the mix. But my question also then is, maybe this is a more rhetorical question, is the role of the kind of cultural and social components that happen in the real world. We can think easily about all the ways that they may accelerate innovation, but my question also is, are they in some instances potentially a drag? And I thought of this with your railroad slide because, for instance, the car developing as a quote-unquote horseless carriage, that was a kind of culturally relatively frictionless way for it to develop as a kind of seeming modification of an existing thing, whereas in fact it was very much a paradigm shift in a world without cultural perceptions of objects. One could imagine introducing innovative technologies much more easily as a set of unexpected combinations. Does that make sense as a question? That could culture or innovation be in some sense also a friction on innovation as well as an accelerant versus the idealized model?
I think I'm a little bit lost at this stage, so I'll do my best to answer. Human design is a wonderful thing, and having looked at technology, I spent 12 years studying and writing this book and reading an awful lot about technology, talking to engineers and recalling my own engineering background and talking to people at Xerox PARC where I was. Technology as an object of study is not simpler than the economy as an object of study, or the legal system, or musicology, or anything else. We tend to think it is, and I think that's where all the problems start. We tend to conflate one thing with another. Invention, as I said, is a rather complicated process, and I said I was ruthlessly compressing it into trying to meet a need with an idea of some effect that would do that. Even designers don't sit down and think that way, but implicitly that's what you're trying to do. You are influenced by society that way. You have to work with what you have. There was a really beautiful talk this morning showing that if society isn't familiar tacitly with certain things, it can't produce what is necessary. Ricardo's talk this morning, as society does influence all these things. So I'm very much at the mercy of trying to take a very complicated subject. I wanted to get to the center of it. What I want to demonstrate is that at the heart of the evolution of the collective of technology is a hereditary mechanism. But that hereditary mechanism, we call it intention or design or anything that can work in many different ways, always amounts to a combination. But nobody sits down and says, we want to go to the moon, show me the combination. Or we're going to make a combination at random, or etc. It's carefully thought through, but it amounts to combinatory things building out of combinations of what previously exists, just as science does in the way its knowledge builds. So there's an awful lot to this subject. The particular lab experiment I showed you, I should have said this is not meant to replicate, actual people or actual stories. Nobody. This was just looking at how that mechanism could be affected or effected in the lab, and could it give anything. We weren't sure that we could get anything at all if we ran an experiment like that. Thank you.